I was not born to carry linens up marble staircases or to bow my head when gentlemen passed without seeing me. I was born to be one of them, and perhaps that is why I recognized him the moment he walked through those gilded doors. A man falling from grace with the quiet dignity of a cathedral, crumbling stone by stone. The Grand Belmont Hotel had become my sanctuary, in the way that convents once sheltered women who had loved too recklessly or trusted too completely. For 3 years, I had worn the simple gray uniform of a chambermaid, had learned to move through corridors like a ghost, had perfected the art of invisibility. The other girls thought me strange, a woman of 28 who spoke too well and read too much, who sometimes paused before mirrors with an expression they could not name. They did not know that the face I saw reflected there once graced the society pages, that the hands now roughened by labor once wore rings worth more than their yearly wages combined. My name, the one I used now, was Emmeline Gray, simple, forgettable, a name that asked nothing and revealed less. But I was born Emmeline Ashford, only daughter of Theodore Ashford, the man who built half the railways in the north of England and died with £17 million to his name. £17 million that now sat in banks across London and Edinburgh, untouched, growing quietly like a garden no one tended. I could have lived in palaces. I chose to live in a small room on the 4th floor of a hotel where no one knew my face and no one whispered my shame. The shame. Even now, the word moves through me like winter wind through an open window. I was 24 when it happened, engaged to a man I believed I loved, a man whose family name opened every door in England. Lord Callum Hartley, second son of the Earl of Pemberton, with eyes the color of summer storms and a smile that made promises his heart never intended to keep. I gave him everything a woman of my station could give before marriage, trusting in the ring upon my finger, in the announcements already sent to the papers. In the future, we had planned together in whispered conversations and stolen moments. He left me 3 weeks before the wedding. Not quietly, not kindly, but with a letter published in a society column, claiming I had pursued him shamelessly, that I was beneath his station despite my fortune, that he could not in good conscience bind himself to a woman of such aggressive and unbecoming character. The words were not his own. I learned later that his mother had written them, that Lady Pemberton had discovered something about my family, some secret my father had taken to his grave, and had decided that the Ashford money was not worth the risk of scandal. What scandal I never learned. My father's solicitors claimed ignorance. My mother had died when I was born, and there were no aunts or uncles to question. I was left with only the wreckage, the whispers that followed me through ballrooms, the invitations that stopped arriving, the friends who crossed streets to avoid meeting my eyes. Within 6 months, I had become a cautionary tale, a name spoken in lowered voices to warn young ladies about the dangers of reaching above their station. So, I vanished. I gave my father's house to a charitable trust, instructed my solicitors to manage my fortune in silence, and took a position at the Grand Belmont under a false name. The work was hard, and at first my hands blistered and bled from wringing sheets and scrubbing floors. But there was peace in it, a strange and unexpected peace. No one expected anything of me except clean rooms and punctuality. No one judged my heart or questioned my worth. I was simply Gray, the quiet maid on the 3rd floor, and in that simplicity I found something I had lost long ago, the freedom to exist without apology. Mr. Reginald Thornberry, the hotel manager, was a man who had memorized every rule of social hierarchy without understanding any of them. He was perhaps 45, with a thin mustache he groomed obsessively and small eyes that calculated the worth of every person who passed before them. He treated the wealthy guests like visiting royalty and the staff like furniture that occasionally required polishing. I had learned to avoid his attention, to be efficient and invisible, to never give him cause to notice me. That November evening, the evening that changed everything, I was arranging fresh flowers in the main corridor when the doors opened and winter entered with him. He was tall, taller than I remembered from the newspapers and the glimpses I had caught at balls years ago before my fall. Lord Sebastian Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, was a man whose portrait hung in the National Gallery and whose family had held their title since the time of the Tudors. I had never spoken to him, had only seen him from across crowded rooms, but I knew his face the way one knows the faces of monuments. Strong jaw, dark hair touched with early gray at the temples, eyes the deep brown of aged mahogany. He was perhaps 35, though tonight he looked older, worn in the way that men look worn when they have carried burdens too heavy and too long. He wore a coat that had once been fine, but now showed signs of careful mending. His boots, though polished, were creased with age. He carried no luggage, only a small leather case, and he walked with the particular straightness of a man determined not to bend even as the world pressed down upon him. I watched from the shadows of the corridor as he approached the front desk, as he spoke words too quiet for me to hear. As Mr. Thornberry examined him with those calculating eyes, and then smiled the smile I had come to recognize. It was the smile he wore when he sensed weakness, when he scented blood. The rumors about the Duke of Ashworth had reached even the servants' quarters. A business partner had betrayed him, had forged documents and stolen investments, had left him with debts that swallowed his estates one by one. Ashworth Hall, his family's seat for 300 years, was said to be on the verge of seizure. His accounts were frozen while solicitors untangled the web of fraud. One of the oldest and most respected names in England was crumbling, and all of London watched with the particular satisfaction society reserves for the fall of the mighty. I should have looked away. I should have returned to my flowers and my invisibility, should have let the drama unfold without me. But something in the Duke's stillness held me there, something in the way he stood before Thornberry's growing hostility without flinching. I set down my vase and moved closer, telling myself I only wished to hear, only wished to understand. The Duke's rooms are reserved for 3 nights, he was saying, his voice low and controlled. I have sent word to my solicitor regarding the payment. The matter will be resolved by morning. Mr. Thornberry's smile widened, and I saw him glance around the lobby, noting the other guests who lingered near the fireplace, the elderly couple examining the evening papers, the young merchant and his wife who had arrived that afternoon. An audience. Thornberry lived for audiences. I am afraid, Your Grace, that we have received concerning information about your current financial situation. His voice carried, deliberately loud, deliberately clear. The Grand Belmont has a reputation to maintain. We cannot extend credit to guests whose ability to pay is in question. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I watched his hands, the way they remained still at his sides, the way his fingers did not curl into fists, though surely they wished to. I assure you, he said quietly, that my word has always been sufficient guarantee for any debt. Perhaps once, Your Grace. Thornberry was enjoying himself now, drunk on his petty power, on the opportunity to humiliate a man so far above his station. But circumstances change. We have all read the papers. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Your estates are gone. Your accounts are frozen. You are, if I may speak plainly, bankrupt. The word fell into the lobby like a stone into still water. I saw the elderly couple look up from their papers, saw the merchant's wife whisper to her husband behind her gloved hand. The Duke stood motionless, his face a mask that revealed nothing, but I knew that mask. I had worn it myself in ballrooms and drawing rooms as the whispers grew around me and the doors closed one by one. I must ask you to leave, Thornberry continued. The Grand Belmont cannot accommodate guests who cannot pay their bills. Surely you understand. I have stayed at this hotel, the Duke said, his voice still quiet but edged now with something that might have been pain, for 15 years. My father stayed here before me. My grandfather helped fund its construction. History, Your Grace, does not pay invoices. Thornberry gestured toward the door with a flick of his pale fingers. I will have your case brought around. You will find other accommodations, I am sure, more suitable to your present circumstances." The Duke did not move. For a long moment, he simply stood there, and I saw in his stillness not defeat, but the gathering of dignity, the marshalling of pride that would not allow him to crumble in public. He would walk out of those doors with his head high, I knew. He would find some cold street, some lesser establishment that would take him on credit or charity, and he would endure this humiliation as he had surely endured so many others in recent months. But he should not have to. The thought came to me with startling clarity, with the force of recognition. I knew this pain. I knew what it was to stand before the judgment of small men and smaller minds, to feel the ground give way beneath feet that had once walked on marble. I knew the loneliness of falling, the terrible isolation of losing everything the world had taught you to value. I stepped forward before I could think better of it, before the cautious voice in my mind could remind me of all I had to lose. The sound of my footsteps on the polished floor seemed impossibly loud, and Thornberry turned toward me with an expression of irritated confusion. "Gray," he snapped, "you have no business in the lobby. Return to your duties." I ignored him. I walked past him, past the watching guests, past the vast oil paintings and crystal chandeliers, until I stood beside the Duke of Ashworth. He looked down at me with dark eyes that held surprise and something else, something like the wariness of a man who had learned to expect cruelty from unexpected quarters. I had not planned what I would say. I had not calculated or considered. I simply opened my mouth and let the truth, a truth I had hidden for 3 years, rise to the surface like a body too long submerged. "Mr. Thornberry," I said, and my voice did not waver. Though my heart beat so hard I feared it might escape my chest, "I would like to make a purchase." Thornberry stared at me as if I had begun speaking in tongues. "A purchase," he repeated. "Gray, have you lost your mind? You are a chambermaid. You cannot purchase so much as a cup of tea in this establishment." "I am not speaking of tea," I said. "I am speaking of the hotel, the Grand Belmont. I wish to purchase it." The silence that followed was absolute. I felt the Duke's gaze on me, felt the weight of every eye in the lobby pressing down upon my shoulders. Thornberry's mouth opened and closed without sound, and for one brief moment I allowed myself to savor his confusion, his utter inability to comprehend what was happening. "The hotel," he finally managed. "You wish to purchase the hotel." He laughed, a sharp and ugly sound. "This is a joke, some absurd prank. I will have you dismissed for this, Gray. I will have you thrown into the street." I turned to face him fully, and something in my expression made his laughter die. I had not looked at anyone this way in 3 years, had not allowed anyone to see the woman who lived beneath the gray uniform and the downcast eyes. But I remembered how to stand, how to hold my chin, how to let my voice carry the authority of 17 million pounds. "The Grand Belmont was valued at 9 million pounds in its last assessment," I said calmly. "I am prepared to offer 10 million. In cash. My solicitors can have the papers drawn up by morning." Thornberry's face had gone pale. "This is madness," he whispered. "You are a maid, a servant. You cannot possibly have that kind of money." I reached into the pocket of my uniform, where I kept a small card I had never expected to use. It was old now, slightly worn at the edges, but the name embossed upon it was still legible. I held it out to him, and watched his eyes move across the letters, watched understanding dawn like cold water over flame. "Emmeline Ashford," he read aloud, and his voice cracked on my name. Ashford. The Ashford fortune. "The very same," I said. I turned to the Duke, who was watching me with an expression I could not quite decipher. Shock, certainly, but something else beneath it, something that looked almost like hope. "Your Grace," I continued quietly, "I apologize for the treatment you have received in this establishment. It will not happen again. Please, Allow me to have a suite prepared for you. You may stay as long as you wish, as my guest." He did not answer immediately. I saw his pride warring with his circumstances, saw the conflict play across features that had been schooled all his life to reveal nothing. Finally, slowly, he inclined his head. "Miss Ashford," he said, and his voice was rough, "I cannot accept charity." "It is not charity," I said. "Consider it an investment in justice." I looked back at Thornberry, who stood frozen with my card still clutched in his trembling fingers. "And as for you, Mr. Thornberry, you are dismissed. Collect your belongings and leave within the hour." His mouth opened to protest, but no words came. I had taken his power as easily as one snuffs a candle, and we both knew it. He turned and walked toward the back offices on unsteady legs, a broken man leaving a room that would never again submit to his petty tyrannies. The Duke of Ashworth and I stood alone in the lobby, surrounded by watching eyes and whispered speculation. I had destroyed my anonymity in a single moment. By morning, all of London would know that Emmeline Ashford had resurfaced, that the scandalous heiress had been hiding as a chambermaid, that she had purchased a hotel for £10 million to defend a bankrupt nobleman. I should have felt regret. I should have felt fear. But as I met the Duke's dark eyes, as I saw the question forming there, all I felt was the strange exhilaration of a woman who had finally stopped hiding. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why would you do this for me?" I looked at him, at this proud and broken man, at this stranger whose fall from grace echoed my own, and I told him the only truth that mattered. "Because I know what it is to stand alone," I said, "and because no one stood for me." The clock in the corner struck 9. And somewhere in the city, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall. I did not know what morning would bring, what consequences my actions would summon, what new chapter of scandal and whisper awaited me. But I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like warmth after long cold, that I would not run again. Whatever came next, I would face it as myself. The snow fell through the night, draping London in white silence, and I did not sleep. I sat by the window of my small room on the 4th floor, watching the flakes descend through the glow of gas lamps, and I thought about what I had done. By morning, every newspaper in the city would carry the story. The reclusive Ashford heiress, hidden for 3 years as a common maid. The bankrupt Duke of Ashworth, publicly humiliated and then rescued by a woman in a grey uniform. Society would feast upon us both, and I had served us up like lambs to wolves. Yet I could not bring myself to regret it. There had been something in his eyes when Thornberry spoke those words, when the manager pronounced him bankrupt before an audience of strangers. Not anger, not even humiliation, but something worse, the quiet acceptance of a man who had grown accustomed to blows. I knew that acceptance. I had worn it like a second skin for months after my broken engagement, after the whispers and the closed doors, after I learned that society's memory for scandal is long and its capacity for forgiveness is small. To see it in him, in a man whose family name had commanded respect for centuries, had stirred something in me I thought long buried. Compassion, perhaps, or recognition, or something more dangerous still. The morning came gray and cold, and with it came the consequences I had anticipated. Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper, knocked on my door before 7, her face a canvas of shock and confusion. The staff, she told me haltingly, did not know what to make of the news. The other maids were whispering, the footmen were staring, and no one knew whether to curtsy to me or hand me a mop. I told her I would address the staff within the hour, and I dressed with care for the first time in 3 years. I had kept one trunk of my former wardrobe, stored in the attic of the hotel with my few other possessions. The gown I chose was simple by the standards of my old life. Deep blue silk with modest embroidery at the collar and cuffs, but it fit me still, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger. The woman who looked back at me was neither the bright-eyed heiress of 5 years ago nor the invisible chambermaid of last night. She was someone new, someone forged in the space between those two lives, and I did not yet know what she was capable of. I descended to the staff quarters and spoke to the assembled employees with as much honesty as I could manage. I told them my name, my history, my reasons for hiding. I told them that the hotel was now mine, but that I had no intention of dismissing anyone who wished to remain. I told them that I valued their work, that I had learned in my years among them to respect the dignity of service, and that I hoped they would judge me by my actions rather than by the gossip that would surely follow. Some of them believed me, others did not. I saw suspicion in certain faces, resentment in others, and I could not blame them. I had deceived them, had let them think me one of their own, while hiding a fortune that could have fed their families for generations. Trust, once broken, is not easily mended, and I knew I would have to earn theirs again slowly, through time and consistency, through proving that the woman I had been as Gray was no less real than the woman I had been as Ashford. After the meeting, I sent word to my solicitors in Edinburgh. The purchase of the Grand Belmont would require weeks of negotiation with its current owners, a consortium of businessmen who had acquired it a decade ago, but I had no doubt they would accept my offer. £10 million was considerably more than the property was worth, and money, in the end, speaks louder than sentiment. It was nearly noon before I allowed myself to think of him. The Duke had been given the finest suite in the hotel, the one reserved for visiting royalty and foreign dignitaries. I had not seen him since the lobby, had not spoken to him beyond those few charged words, and I found myself hesitating outside his door like a schoolgirl uncertain of her welcome. This was foolish, I told myself. I was the owner of this establishment, or would be soon. I had every right to inquire after a guest's comfort. But it was not comfort I wished to inquire after, and I knew it. I knocked, and a long moment passed before I heard his voice, low and wary, bidding me enter. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the winter light, and he did not turn when I entered. The suite was magnificent, all velvet draperies and gilded furniture, but he seemed somehow apart from it, a figure carved from different stone. His coat was removed, his waistcoat unbuttoned, and I saw for the first time the weariness that wealth once hid, the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worried days. "Miss Ashford," he said, still facing the window, "I wondered when you would come." I closed the door behind me and remained near it, keeping distance between us that felt both necessary and insufficient. "I wish to ensure you had everything you need," I said. "The suite is to your satisfaction, I hope." He turned then, and his eyes moved over me with an expression I could not read. "The gown suits you better than the uniform," he said quietly, though I confess I found something admirable in the uniform as well. I felt heat rise to my cheeks and cursed myself for it. "I did not expect you to find anything admirable in a chambermaid, Your Grace." "Sebastian," he said, "if you are to buy hotels on my behalf and make an enemy of every gossip in London for my sake, I think you might call me by my Christian name." I hesitated, tasting the shape of it in my mind. Sebastian. It was a name from old stories, from saints and martyrs, from men who suffered beautifully and were remembered for their wounds. "Very well," I said, "Sebastian. And you must call me Emmeline." "Emmeline." He spoke it slowly, as if learning a new language. "It suits you. Classical. Strong." He moved away from the window, closer to where I stood, and I became aware of his height, of the breadth of his shoulders, of the scent of sandalwood, and something deeper that clung to his skin. "Why did you hide, Emmeline? A woman with your fortune could have weathered any scandal." The question cut closer than I expected, and I looked away from him, toward the fire crackling in the grate. "Not all wounds are visible," I said. "Not all prisons have walls. I was engaged once to a man who taught me exactly how little my fortune meant when measured against reputation. When he left me, he ensured that every door in society closed behind him. I could have stayed and fought, I suppose. But I was tired of fighting, tired of smiling at people who whispered about me the moment I turned away. He was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentler. I heard rumors years ago. The Ashford heiress and the Hartley boy. I never knew the details. The details are sordid and tedious, I said. The summary is simple. I loved unwisely, trusted completely, and paid the price that women always pay for such mistakes. Society forgave him, of course. Society always forgives the man. He nodded slowly, and I saw understanding in his eyes, the understanding of someone who had also learned hard lessons about the world's capacity for cruelty. And so you vanished, he said, became someone else. I became no one, I corrected him. And there was freedom in that. More freedom than I ever found in ballrooms or drawing rooms. I met his gaze, but I could not stay no one forever. Not when I saw you standing there, being treated as I was treated. Not when I knew I had the power to stop it. He took another step closer, and now only an arm's length separated us. I could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver threaded through his dark hair, the faint scar on his jaw that spoke of some old injury. He was not a young man, not anymore, but there was something in his bearing that transcended age, a gravity that drew me toward him like tide toward moon. You should not have done it, he said softly. You have made yourself a target, Emmeline. My enemies will become your enemies now. The men who destroyed me will not take kindly to your interference. A chill passed through me, but I did not let it show. Who are these men? I asked. The ones who betrayed you. His jaw tightened. A man named Frederick Vance, he said. My business partner for 5 years. I trusted him with my investments, my accounts, my family's legacy. He forged my signature on a dozen documents, took loans in my name, funneled the money into his own pockets. By the time I discovered the fraud, it was too late. The creditors came for everything. And where is Mr. Vance now? Fled. Sebastian's voice was flat, controlled, but I heard the rage beneath it. To the continent, most likely. My solicitors are searching for him, but he covered his tracks well. He was always clever. I was merely fool enough to trust him. You were not a fool, I said. You were betrayed. There is a difference. He looked at me with those dark eyes, and something shifted in his expression, something that made my breath catch. You are kinder than I deserve, he said. I am a ruined man, Emmeline. I have nothing to offer you, nothing to give in return for what you have done. My title is an empty word, my estates are gone, my name is a joke whispered in clubs and drawing rooms. Why would you ally yourself with such wreckage? I thought of all the answers I could give, the sensible answers about justice and compassion, about solidarity between those who had suffered at society's hands. But when I opened my mouth, a different truth emerged, one I had not known I carried. Because you did not look away, I said, last night in the lobby when I stepped forward. Every other man I have known would have looked away from a chambermaid who dared to speak. But you looked at me. You saw me. Do you know how rare that is, Sebastian? Do you know how long it has been since anyone truly saw me? The silence that followed was thick with things unspoken. He raised one hand, slowly, as if giving me time to step back, to refuse. When I did not move, his fingers touched my cheek, light as a whisper, tracing the curve of my jaw with a tenderness that made something twist in my chest. I see you, he said. I see a woman who hid her light for 3 years and then blazed forth like a comet when someone needed her. I see courage dressed in silk and strength masked as kindness. He paused, and his voice dropped lower still. And I see something else, something that frightens me. What do you see? I barely recognized my own voice, thin and breathless as a reed in wind. Hope, he said, and I have not felt hope in a very long time. I should have stepped back. I should have remembered that we were strangers still. That scandal clung to both of us like smoke, that the world outside this room was already sharpening its knives. But his hand was warm against my skin, and his eyes held mine with an intensity that made me forget caution, forget propriety, forget everything except the simple, startling fact of his presence. A knock at the door shattered the moment like glass. I stepped back quickly, smoothing my skirts with hands that trembled slightly, and Sebastian turned away toward the window once more. When I opened the door, I found a young footman standing there, pale-faced and nervous. "Begging your pardon, Miss Ashford," he said. "There is a visitor in the lobby asking for you. He says it is urgent." "Who is it?" I asked, though something in my stomach had already begun to sink. The footman swallowed. "He says his name is Lord Callum Hartley, miss, and he says he is your fiancé." The word struck me like a blow. I felt the blood drain from my face, felt the room tilt slightly around me. Behind me, I heard Sebastian turn, heard his sharp intake of breath. "Emmeline," he said, but I could not answer him. Callum. After 3 years of silence, 3 years of hiding, he had found me. And he had come not to apologize, not to beg forgiveness, but to claim me still, as if the engagement he had so publicly destroyed still bound us together. I did not know what game he was playing. I did not know what he wanted, what new cruelty he had devised. But as I walked toward the door, toward the lobby where my past waited with poison in its smile, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was not the same woman he had broken. And whatever came next, I would not break again. He stood in the center of the lobby like a man who had never been denied anything in his life, and perhaps he had not. Lord Callum Hartley was as handsome as I remembered, perhaps more so, with that golden hair and those storm-gray eyes that had once made me believe in fairy tales. He wore a coat of finest wool, a cravat pinned with a sapphire that caught the winter light, and he smiled when he saw me descending the staircase, smiled as if 3 years had not passed, as if he had not left me in ruins, as if we were simply lovers reunited after a brief separation. "Emmeline," he said, and his voice was warm, honey, sweet, and treacherous. "My darling Emmeline, I have searched for you for so long." I stopped at the bottom of the stairs, keeping the width of the lobby between us. The few guests who lingered near the fireplace watched with undisguised curiosity, and I felt the weight of their attention like hands pressing against my skin. I had spent 3 years learning to be invisible, and now I stood exposed before hungry eyes, a spectacle for their entertainment. "Lord Hartley," I said, and I was proud that my voice did not waver. "You seem to have mistaken me for someone who wishes to be found." His smile flickered just slightly before settling back into place. "You wound me, my love. After everything we shared, after all our plans and promises." He took a step closer, and I saw something shift in his eyes, something cold beneath the warmth. "I understand you are angry. I understand I hurt you. But I have come to make amends. Amends." The word tasted like ash in my mouth. "You published a letter in the society pages calling me shameless and unbecoming. You destroyed my reputation with lies. You took everything I offered you and then discarded me like soiled linen. And now you speak of amends?" "I was young," he said smoothly. "I was under my mother's influence. You must understand, Emmeline, the pressure I faced, my family's expectations, the weight of our name. I made a terrible mistake, and I have regretted it every day since." I looked at him, at this beautiful, hollow man, and I searched within myself for the love I had once felt. I found nothing, not even hatred, which would have been a kind of passion, only a vast, cold emptiness where he had once resided. "What do you want, Callum?" I asked quietly. "You have not searched for me out of regret. You have not come here to apologize. So tell me plainly what you want, and then leave." His mask slipped, just for a moment, and I glimpsed the calculation beneath. "I heard about your purchase," he said. "The hotel. £10 million, they say. A remarkable sum." He paused, letting the words settle. "I also heard about your guest, the bankrupt Duke of Ashworth, rescued from humiliation by the mysterious heiress. It is quite the romantic tale, Emmeline. The papers are already writing about it. I felt a chill trace down my spine. What concern is that of yours? Every concern. He moved closer still, and now I could smell his cologne, that familiar scent of bergamot and cedar that had once made me dizzy with longing. You see, my dear, my situation has changed somewhat since we last met. My father's investments have not performed as well as hoped. The family estates require significant repair. And my mother, who was so eager to end our engagement 3 years ago, has recently reconsidered her position. Understanding dawned like cold water. You want my money? I said flatly. You have come crawling back because you need my fortune. I have come back because I love you, he insisted, but his eyes betrayed him. They were calculating, measuring, weighing my worth in pounds and properties. I have never stopped loving you, Emmeline. Our engagement was never formally dissolved. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of society, we are still promised to one another. The audacity of it stole my breath. You cannot be serious. I am entirely serious. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, yellowed with age. The original contract, he said, signed by your father and mine, binding and legal. I could take this to the courts, Emmeline. I could claim breach of promise. I could drag your name through scandal all over again. I stared at the paper in his hands, at this weapon he wielded so casually, and something inside me shifted. Fear? Yes, but beneath it something harder, something forged in 3 years of solitude and survival. He expected me to crumble. He expected the same frightened girl he had destroyed so easily before. But I was not that girl anymore. You are threatening me, I said, and my voice was steady now, cold as the winter outside. In my own hotel, before witnesses. I am offering you an opportunity, he corrected. We can announce our renewed engagement, a quiet wedding, perhaps in spring. Your fortune, combined with my family's name and connections, would benefit us both. It is a sensible arrangement, Emmeline. Surely you can see that. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him exactly where he could place his sensible arrangement. But before I could speak, a voice came from behind me, deep and dangerous. I believe the lady has made her position clear. I turned to find Sebastian descending the staircase, and the sight of him struck me with unexpected force. He had dressed properly now, in a dark coat that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, and his face wore an expression I had not yet seen on him, something fierce and protective that made my heart stutter in my chest. Callum's eyes narrowed. Ashworth, he said. I had heard you were here, living off Miss Ashford's charity. How the mighty have fallen. Sebastian reached my side and stood there, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, the solid reality of his presence. Better to fall with honor, he said quietly, than to crawl without it. The insult landed, and I saw Callum's handsome face twist with anger. You dare lecture me about honor? You, who lost everything through your own foolishness? He laughed, a sharp and ugly sound. I know all about your troubles, Ashworth. I know about Vance and his schemes. In fact, I know rather more than you might expect. Something in his tone made me go still. I looked at Callum, at the satisfaction gleaming in his eyes, and a terrible suspicion began to form. What do you mean? Sebastian's voice was low, controlled, but I heard the tension beneath it. What do you know about Vance? Callum smiled, and in that smile I saw the truth before he spoke it. Frederick Vance is my cousin, he said. Did you not know? His mother was a Hartley before her marriage. We grew up together, played together, learned together. He paused, savoring the moment. Learned, for instance, how to identify wealthy fools and separate them from their fortunes. The lobby seemed to tilt around me. I heard Sebastian's sharp intake of breath, felt his body go rigid beside me. You, he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. You were part of it. The fraud, the theft. You helped him destroy me. I merely provided introductions, Callum said smoothly. Frederick did the rest, though I will admit the profits were quite satisfactory. At least they were for a time. He shrugged, an elegant gesture of false regret. Unfortunately, Frederick proved less reliable than anticipated. He kept rather more than his agreed share before disappearing. Which brings us back to the matter at hand. He turned to me, and his smile widened. You see, Emmeline, I find myself in need of funds, and you have funds in abundance. It seems a natural solution, does it not? Marry me, and all of this unpleasantness goes away. Refuse me, and I will be forced to pursue legal remedies. The breach of promise suit alone would cost you a fortune in solicitor's fees, and the scandal would follow you for the rest of your days. I looked at him, at this man I had once loved, and I felt something cold and clear crystallize within me. It was not anger, though anger was there. It was not fear, though fear flickered at the edges. It was certainty, the absolute, unshakable certainty that I would never again allow this man to control my fate. You have made a miscalculation, I said quietly. He raised an eyebrow. Have I? You assume I care about scandal. I took a step toward him, and something in my expression made him step back. You assume I fear the courts, the gossip, the whispered judgments of people whose opinions mean nothing to me. But I have already survived all of that, Callum. I have already lost everything society values, and I discovered something remarkable in the losing. What is that? He asked, and for the first time I heard uncertainty in his voice. Freedom. I let the word hang in the air between us. I spent 3 years as a chambermaid, scrubbing floors and carrying linens, and I was happier in that gray uniform than I ever was in your arms. I have no reputation left to protect, no standing to maintain, no fragile position that your threats can endanger. You cannot hurt me any more, Callum. You have nothing I want and nothing I fear. He stared at me, and I watched the realization dawn in his eyes, the understanding that I was not bluffing, that the weapon he had carried so confidently into this confrontation was useless against a woman who had already been broken and rebuilt. As for your breach of promise suit, I continued, I encourage you to file it. My solicitors will be delighted to present evidence of the letter you published, the lies you told, the deliberate destruction of my reputation. We will see how sympathetic the courts are to a man who publicly humiliated his fiancée and then returned 3 years later to extort her. This is not over, he said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. You will regret this, Emmeline. No, Sebastian said, and he stepped forward until he stood between Callum and me, a wall of quiet fury. You are the one who will have regrets, Hartley. You have just confessed, before witnesses, to your involvement in the fraud that destroyed me. My solicitors will be very interested to hear about your connection to Vance. I suspect the authorities will be interested as well. Callum's face went pale. You have no proof. I have your words, spoken in a public lobby, before a dozen witnesses. Sebastian's voice was soft, almost gentle, but beneath it lay something dangerous. I have 3 years of rage and nothing left to lose. And now I have a name, a connection, a thread to follow back to the man who stole everything from me. He smiled, and it was not a kind smile. Thank you, Hartley. You have given me more than you know. For a long moment, Callum stood frozen, his handsome face twisted with fury and fear. Then, without another word, he turned and strode toward the doors, his expensive boots striking the marble floor with sharp, angry sounds. The doors swung open, letting in a gust of cold air and swirling snow, and then he was gone, vanished into the winter morning like a nightmare dispelled by dawn. I stood motionless, trembling with the aftermath of confrontation, and I did not realize I was shaking until Sebastian's hand closed gently over mine. Emmeline, he said softly, are you all right? I looked up at him, at this man who had stood beside me without hesitation, who had defended me without being asked, and I felt something break open in my chest, something I had kept locked away for 3 long years. "I do not know," I admitted. "I thought I was past all of this. I thought I had left him behind." "You have," he said. "What happened just now was not the return of your past. It was its ending." He squeezed my hand gently. "You faced him, Emmeline. You did not bend. You did not break. You were magnificent." The word wrapped around me like warmth, and I felt tears prick at my eyes. I did not let them fall. "I have had practice," I said. 3 years of practice in surviving." "Then let me help you do more than survive." His voice was rough with emotion. "Let me help you live. Let me stand beside you, not as a debt repaid or a charity case, but as something more. As a partner, as a friend, as whatever you will allow me to be." I looked at him, at his dark eyes filled with hope and pain and something that might have been the beginning of love, and I felt the walls I had built around my heart begin to crack. "Sebastian," I whispered, and his name on my lips felt like a promise. But the moment was broken by a commotion near the front desk, raised voices and hurried footsteps. A young clerk came rushing toward us, his face flushed with urgency. "Miss Ashford, Your Grace," he gasped. "Forgive the interruption, but there is news, urgent news." "What is it?" I asked, still holding Sebastian's hand, unwilling to release him. The clerk swallowed hard. "A telegram has arrived from Edinburgh. From your solicitors, Miss Ashford." He paused, and something in his expression made my stomach clench. "They say there has been a discovery. Something about your father. Something about his past." I felt the blood drain from my face. My father had been dead for nearly 7 years. What discovery could there possibly be? "What kind of discovery?" Sebastian asked, his voice sharp. The clerk shook his head. "They did not say, Your Grace, only that Miss Ashford must come to Edinburgh immediately. They say it is a matter of utmost importance, a matter concerning her inheritance." I stood in the lobby of my hotel, surrounded by the wreckage of one confrontation and the shadow of another, and I understood that my past was not yet finished with me. Whatever secret my father had carried to his grave, whatever truth Lady Pemberton had discovered all those years ago that had caused her to end my engagement, it was rising to the surface now, and I would have to face it, whatever it was. "I will leave tomorrow," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Please arrange a carriage to the station." "I am coming with you," Sebastian said immediately. "Whatever this is, you should not face it alone." I looked at him, at this man who had entered my life only 2 days ago and had already become essential to it, and I nodded slowly. "Together, then," I said. "Together." The word hung between us like a vow, and outside the windows, the snow continued to fall, blanketing London in white silence, burying the old year beneath its cold embrace and preparing the ground for whatever spring would bring. The train to Edinburgh departed at 7:30 in the morning, cutting through a landscape transformed by snow into something from a dream. I sat by the window of our private compartment, watching the white fields roll past like pages of an unwritten story, and I tried to prepare myself for whatever awaited me at the end of this journey. Sebastian sat across from me, silent but present, his dark eyes watching me with a concern he did not voice. We had spoken little since leaving London. The confrontation with Callum, the revelation of his connection to the fraud that had destroyed Sebastian, the mysterious telegram from my solicitors. It was too much to process, too many threads tangling together into a knot I could not yet see the shape of. I had spent 3 years building a simple life, a quiet existence free from the complications of my past, and now that past was rising around me like floodwaters, threatening to sweep away everything I had constructed. "You should try to rest," Sebastian said softly. "It will be hours yet before we arrive." "I cannot rest," I admitted. "My mind will not quiet itself. I keep thinking about what Lady Pemberton might have discovered all those years ago. What secret about my father could have been terrible enough to end an engagement? Sebastian leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Your father was Theodore Ashford," he said. "I remember the name. He built railways, did he not? Connected half the cities in the north?" "Yes." I smiled slightly, remembering. He was a remarkable man. Born with nothing, the son of a factory worker, but he had a mind for engineering and a gift for seeing opportunities others missed. By the time I was born, he had already made his first million. By the time I was 20, he had made 17 more. "A self-made fortune," Sebastian said. "Impressive, but not scandalous. There must have been something else." I shook my head slowly. "I never knew my mother. She died giving birth to me, and my father rarely spoke of her. He kept no portraits of her in the house, no letters, no mementos. When I asked about her as a child, he would simply say that she had been beautiful and kind, and that losing her had been the greatest sorrow of his life. I assumed his silence was grief. Perhaps it was something else. The train rattled onward, and the snow-covered landscape gave way gradually to the rolling hills of the Midlands. I watched the farms and villages pass, the smoke rising from chimneys, the tiny figures of people going about their daily lives, and I envied them their simplicity. They did not have solicitors waiting with secrets. They did not have pasts rising up to devour them. "Whatever we discover," Sebastian said quietly, "it will not change who you are. The woman I have come to know in these few days, the woman who bought a hotel to defend a stranger's dignity, who faced down her former fiancé without flinching, who chose honesty when deception would have been easier, that woman exists regardless of what your father may have done." I looked at him, at this man who had lost everything and yet still found words to comfort me, and I felt something shift in my chest. "How can you be so certain?" I asked. "You barely know me. I know enough." He held my gaze steadily. "I know that you could have remained invisible, safe in your gray uniform and your borrowed name. I know that you chose to step forward when no one else would. I know that you offered me kindness when I had done nothing to earn it." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rougher. "I know that you are the first person in 3 years who has made me believe that the world might still contain goodness." The words hung between us, heavy with meaning, and I found I could not look away from him. The compartment seemed to shrink around us, the world outside the windows fading into irrelevance. There was only his face, his eyes, the slight tremble in his hands that told me he was not as composed as he appeared. "Sebastian," I whispered, and I did not know what I intended to say, only that his name felt necessary on my lips. He moved before I could continue, crossing the small space between our seats to sit beside me. His hand found mine, fingers intertwining, and the warmth of his touch spread through me like sunlight after long winter. "I have no right to speak of this," he said quietly. "I am a ruined man, Emmeline. I have nothing to offer you except a tarnished name and an uncertain future. But I find I cannot remain silent any longer." He raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, gentle as a prayer. "I am falling in love with you. I think I began falling the moment you stepped out of the shadows and declared your intention to purchase a hotel. I have tried to convince myself it is gratitude, or admiration, or simple loneliness. But it is none of those things. It is love, foolish and inconvenient, and entirely beyond my control." I stared at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he must hear it. I had been loved before, or thought I had. Callum had spoken words of love, had made promises that turned to ash in his mouth. But there had always been something calculated in his affection, something that weighed and measured even as it embraced. Sebastian's declaration held none of that. It was raw, almost painful in its honesty, the confession of a man who had abandoned hope and found it unexpectedly returned. "You are not ruined," I said, and my voice caught on the words. "You are not tarnished. You were betrayed by men without honor, but their treachery does not diminish you." I reached up with my free hand and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw, the scar I had noticed before. "You are the most honorable man I have ever known, and I am falling in love with you too." His breath caught, and for a moment he simply looked at me, as if he could not quite believe what he had heard. Then he leaned forward, slowly, giving me time to pull away, and when I did not, his lips met mine. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, the careful exploration of two people who had been wounded too often to trust easily. But then something shifted, some barrier crumbled, and gentleness gave way to urgency. His arms came around me, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, into the solid warmth of his body, the taste of his mouth, the soft sound he made against my lips that was almost a sob. When we finally parted, breathless and trembling, the train was passing through a tunnel, and darkness pressed against the windows like velvet. I rested my forehead against his, our breath mingling, and I felt tears sliding down my cheeks, though I could not have said whether they were tears of joy or sorrow or simple, overwhelmed relief. "Whatever comes next," I whispered, "we face it together." "Together," he agreed, and kissed me again. We arrived in Edinburgh as the sun was setting, painting the ancient city in shades of gold and rose. The solicitor's office was located on George Street, a dignified building of grey stone with brass plates beside the door bearing names that had represented wealthy families for generations. Mr. Alistair Drummond had served my father for 20 years and had continued to manage my affairs during my years of hiding. He was waiting for us when we arrived, a thin man of perhaps 60 with kind eyes and a worried expression. "Miss Ashford," he said, taking my hands in his. "Thank you for coming so quickly, and this must be the Duke of Ashworth. I have heard much about recent events in London." "Good things, I hope," Sebastian said dryly. "Remarkable things." Mr. Drummond gestured toward his inner office. "Please, come in. I'm afraid what I have to tell you is rather complicated." We settled into leather chairs before a fire that crackled warmly against the Scottish winter, and Mr. Drummond poured whiskey with hands that trembled slightly. I watched him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided meeting my eyes, and my stomach tightened with apprehension. "What have you discovered?" I asked, unable to bear the suspense any longer. Mr. Drummond took a long breath. "Miss Ashford," he began, "what I am about to tell you will be difficult to hear. I must ask you to let me finish before you respond, as the full picture only becomes clear once all the pieces are assembled." I nodded, and Sebastian's hand found mine, holding tight. "Your father," Mr. Drummond continued, "was not born Theodore Ashford. That name was one he adopted when he came to England, at the age of 19. His birth name was Theodore Ashton, and he was not the son of a factory worker, as he claimed. He was the illegitimate son of the Earl of Whitmore." The words seemed to hang in the air, incomprehensible. I stared at Mr. Drummond, certain I had misheard. My father was the son of an earl? "His mother was a housemaid in the earl's estate," Mr. Drummond said quietly. "When she became pregnant, she was dismissed without reference. She raised your father alone, in poverty, working herself to an early grave. Theodore watched her die when he was 15 years old, and he never forgave the family that had abandoned them. I felt the room tilt around me, felt Sebastian's grip tighten on my hand. "Go on," I managed. "Your father changed his name and made his fortune, driven by a fury that never dimmed. He never attempted to contact the Whitmore family, never sought recognition or inheritance, but he kept records, Miss Ashford, meticulous records. Letters his mother had saved, documents proving his parentage, evidence that the Earl of Whitmore had known of his existence and chosen to ignore it." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "My father has been dead for 7 years. What has changed?" Mr. Drummond reached into his desk and withdrew a thick envelope, yellowed with age. "Your father left instructions," he said. "This envelope was to be opened only under specific circumstances. One of those circumstances was if you ever became engaged to a member of the Pemberton family. I felt the blood drain from my face. Lady Pemberton, I whispered. She discovered this. That is why she ended my engagement to Callum. Mr. Drummond nodded slowly. The Pemberton family and the Whitmore family are connected by marriage. Lady Pemberton's mother was a Whitmore. When your engagement was announced, she investigated your background and discovered the truth. She could not allow her son to marry the granddaughter of a housemaid, regardless of your fortune. The irony was bitter as poison. I had been rejected not because of any scandal of my own making, but because of shame that was not mine to carry. My father's illegitimacy, his mother's disgrace, a secret kept for decades. These were the weapons Lady Pemberton had used to destroy me. But there is more, Mr. Drummond continued. The Earl of Whitmore died 6 months ago. He had no legitimate heirs. Under English law, illegitimate children cannot inherit titles, but they can inherit property if specifically named in a will. He paused, and something flickered in his eyes. The Earl's will has been found, Miss Ashford, and it names your father as his sole heir. I could not breathe. I could not think. I sat frozen in my chair while the world rearranged itself around me. My father is dead, I said finally. He cannot inherit anything. No, Mr. Drummond agreed. But you can. As your father's only child, you are entitled to everything the Earl left to him. The estate, the lands, the fortune. He met my eyes at last. Miss Ashford, you are one of the wealthiest women in England. Not merely because of your father's railways, but because of the Whitmore inheritance. Approximately £12 million in total, in addition to what you already possess. The number was staggering, incomprehensible. I heard Sebastian's sharp intake of breath, felt him turn to look at me. There are those who will contest the will, Mr. Drummond warned. The Pemberton family, among others. They will argue that an illegitimate line cannot inherit, that the will is invalid, that your father's claim was never proven. There will be legal battles, Miss Ashford, possibly years of them. Let them come, I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and cold. Let them contest it. Let them drag my father's name through the courts and the papers. I straightened in my chair, and something that had been twisted inside me for years began to unknot. My grandmother was a housemaid who was seduced and abandoned by a man who should have protected her. My father was a boy who watched his mother die in poverty while his father lived in luxury. They deserve justice, Mr. Drummond. They deserve recognition. And I will fight for it, no matter how long it takes. Sebastian's hand squeezed mine, and when I turned to look at him, I saw pride shining in his dark eyes. You are magnificent, he said softly. I believe I mentioned that once before. Despite everything, I felt a smile tug at my lips. You did. Mr. Drummond cleared his throat. There is one more matter, he said carefully. The will contains a condition. In order to claim the Whitmore inheritance, you must present yourself to the remaining family members and formally declare your lineage. There is to be a gathering at Whitmore Hall in 3 days' time. All interested parties will be present. Including the Pembertons? I asked. Including the Pembertons, Mr. Drummond confirmed. Including Lady Pemberton herself. I thought of the woman who had destroyed my engagement, who had written that cruel letter in her son's name, who had cast me out of society to protect her family's precious reputation. I thought of facing her, of standing before her with the truth in my hands like a weapon. Then I will be there, I said, and I will make her look me in the eyes when she hears what her family did to mine. The fire crackled in the grate, and outside the window, Edinburgh's lights were beginning to glitter in the darkness. I had come here seeking answers to a mystery, and I had found something far more complex. A history of pain and abandonment, stretching back generations, a legacy of shame transformed into fortune, a family that had wronged mine and would now be forced to reckon with the consequences. I did not know what awaited me at Whitmore Hall. I did not know if the courts would uphold my claim or if the Pembertons would find some way to deny me what was rightfully mine. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was no longer hiding, and I would never hide again. Whitmore Hall rose from the frozen landscape like a monument to centuries of privilege, its gray stones and towering chimneys speaking of wealth accumulated over generations while my grandmother scrubbed floors and died in poverty. I stood at the end of the long drive, Sebastian beside me, and I let myself feel the full weight of this moment. My father had never seen this place. He had built an empire of his own, rather than beg for recognition from the family that had abandoned him. But I would walk through those doors today, and I would claim what was owed. The carriage had brought us from Edinburgh through countryside, blanketed in snow, past villages where smoke rose from cottage chimneys and farmers tended their livestock despite the cold. It was beautiful, this land that might have been my father's birthright, that might now become mine. But I felt no joy in its beauty. Only a grim determination to see this through to its end. "Are you ready?" Sebastian asked quietly. I turned to look at him, at this man who had become my anchor in the storm of these past days. He wore a borrowed coat, having lost most of his wardrobe along with everything else, but he carried himself with the dignity of generations. The Duke of Ashworth, ruined and rebuilt, standing beside the illegitimate granddaughter of an earl. We were quite a pair. "I am ready," I said. "Whatever happens in there, I am ready." He offered me his arm, and together we walked up the drive toward the great doors of Whitmore Hall. The gathering had been arranged in the main drawing room, a vast space of velvet and gilt that could have swallowed my father's modest study 10 times over. A fire blazed in the enormous hearth, and candles flickered in crystal chandeliers, casting warm light over faces that watched our entrance with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. I recognized Lady Pemberton immediately. She sat near the fire like a queen on her throne, her silver hair perfectly arranged, her black gown speaking of mourning she probably did not feel. Her eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on me the moment I entered, and I saw recognition flash across her features. She had not expected me to come. She had thought me broken, scattered, destroyed by the scandal she had orchestrated 3 years ago. She was wrong. Beside her sat Callum, pale and tense, his handsome face marred by something that might have been fear. He had not expected to see me again so soon, and certainly not in these circumstances. The threat he had made in my hotel lobby, the breach of promise suit, the leverage he had thought he held, all of it crumbled to nothing in the face of what I now knew. There were others in the room as well. Distant cousins of the Whitmore line, solicitors and barristers in somber suits, a magistrate whose presence suggested the legal weight of these proceedings. Mr. Drummond stood near the window, his expression carefully neutral, and he gave me a small nod as I entered. "Miss Ashford." A thin man with wire spectacles rose from his seat near the fire. He appeared to be presiding over this gathering, some sort of family solicitor or executor. "Thank you for coming. I am Mr. Pemberton, no relation to Lady Pemberton here, merely a coincidence of names. I have been charged with administering the late Earl's estate." I inclined my head. "Thank you for receiving me, Mr. Pemberton. You understand the purpose of this gathering," he continued. "The late Earl of Whitmore left a will naming Theodore Ashton, later known as Theodore Ashford, as his sole heir. As Mr. Ashford is deceased, his estate and any inheritance pass to his surviving issue. That would be you, Miss Ashford." "That is my understanding," I said. "There are those who contest this claim." Mr. Pemberton glanced toward Lady Pemberton, who sat rigid with barely contained fury. "They argue that an illegitimate line cannot inherit, that the will was made under duress or diminished capacity, that the proof of Mr. Ashford's parentage is insufficient." "I expected as much," I said calmly. "I am prepared to address each of these concerns. The next hour was a battlefield of documents and testimonies. I presented the letters my grandmother had kept, the birth records Mr. Drummond had uncovered, the sworn statements from servants who had worked at Whitmore Hall during the years of my grandmother's employment. I spoke of my father's life, his struggles, his triumphs, the fortune he had built without a penny of help from the family that should have supported him. I spoke without tears, without pleading, without the trembling vulnerability that Lady Pemberton clearly expected. I spoke as what I was, a woman claiming what was rightfully hers. Sebastian stood beside me throughout, a silent pillar of support. When Lady Pemberton's barrister attempted to discredit my evidence, Sebastian stepped forward and offered testimony of his own. His knowledge of the Whitmore family history, details only someone of his standing would know, confirmation that the documents I presented were consistent with records held by other noble families. His voice was steady and authoritative, the voice of a duke regardless of his current circumstances, and I saw the effect it had on the room. When the testimonies were finished, Mr. Pemberton called for a brief recess. The gathering dispersed into smaller groups, and I found myself standing near the window, looking out at the snow-covered gardens while my fate was decided by strangers. You think yourself very clever, do you not? I turned to find Lady Pemberton standing behind me, her face twisted with contempt. She had approached silently, and now she stood close enough that her whispered words would not carry to the others in the room. Lady Pemberton, I said evenly, I wondered when you would speak to me directly. You should have stayed hidden. Her voice was venomous. You should have remained in your little hotel, playing at being a servant. Instead, you come here, parading your illegitimate blood before decent people, shaming families who have held their honor for generations. My blood is no more illegitimate than the circumstances that created it, I replied. My grandmother was seduced by a man who should have protected her, then cast out when she became inconvenient. The shame belongs to those who abandoned her, not to those who survived their cruelty. Lady Pemberton's eyes narrowed. You speak of survival, but you have not survived yet, girl. I ended your engagement once. I destroyed your reputation with a single letter. Do you think I cannot do it again? I looked at her, at this woman who had caused me so much pain, and I felt something unexpected. Pity. She was old, bitter, clinging to notions of honor and bloodline that the world was slowly leaving behind. She had built her life on the foundations of appearances and social standing, and now those foundations were crumbling beneath her feet. You can try, I said quietly, but I am not the same woman I was 3 years ago. I have learned that reputation is a cage, Lady Pemberton. Those who fear its loss are prisoners to the opinions of others. I no longer fear what you or anyone else might say about me. I have scrubbed floors and carried linens. I have slept in a servant's room and worked until my hands bled. And I have discovered that there is no shame in honest labor, no dishonor in surviving, no weakness in choosing dignity over pretense. I straightened my shoulders. You cannot hurt me anymore. Your weapons are useless against someone who has already lost everything and found herself richer for the loss. Lady Pemberton stared at me, and for a moment I saw something flicker in her cold eyes. Not warmth, not remorse, but perhaps a grudging recognition that I was no longer the frightened girl she had once destroyed. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted near the door. Voices raised in alarm, footsteps pounding on marble floors. I turned to see a young clerk rushing into the room, his face flushed with urgency. Mr. Pemberton, he gasped. There is news. From London. The authorities have arrested Frederick Vance. The room went silent. I saw Sebastian go rigid, his face draining of color. Callum, standing near his mother, had gone pale as milk. Arrested? Sebastian's voice was hoarse. Where? Dover, the clerk said. He was attempting to board a ship to France. He had documents with him, Your Grace, ledgers, records of every transaction, every forged signature, every pound he stole. He paused, swallowing hard. And letters from Lord Callum Hartley, instructing him on how to proceed. Every eye in the room turned toward Callum. He stood frozen, his handsome face twisted with fear, and I watched as the weight of his crimes finally caught up with him. "This is absurd," Lady Pemberton said sharply. "My son had nothing to do with any fraud. The letters suggest otherwise, my lady." The clerk's voice was apologetic but firm. "Lord Hartley is to be taken into custody upon his return to London. The charges are conspiracy to commit fraud, theft, and forgery." The silence that followed was absolute. I looked at Callum, at this man who had broken my heart and tried to extort me, who had helped destroy Sebastian out of greed and spite, and I felt no satisfaction in his downfall. Only a weary recognition that the world, eventually, balances its scales. "Sebastian," I said softly, and he turned to me with eyes that glittered with unshed tears. "It is over. You are vindicated." He crossed the room in 3 strides and took my hands in his. His grip was tight, almost painful, and when he spoke, his voice broke on the words. "Because of you," he said. "All of this. Because you stepped out of the shadows and refused to let injustice stand. If you had not bought that hotel, if you had not faced Callum in the lobby, if he had not been foolish enough to boast of his connection to Vance, none of this would have happened. Justice would have found him eventually," I said. "Perhaps, but you hastened its arrival." He raised my hands to his lips. "You gave me back my honor, Emmeline. You gave me back hope. How can I ever repay such a debt?" I looked up at him, at his dark eyes full of love and gratitude, and something deeper still, and I knew the answer with absolute certainty. "Marry me," I said. The words fell into the silence of the room, and I heard gasps from the assembled company, saw Lady Pemberton's face contort with outrage, but I did not care. I did not care what any of them thought, what scandal they whispered, what judgments they passed. I cared only for the man standing before me, holding my hands as if I were the most precious thing in the world. "Emmeline," Sebastian breathed, "you cannot mean it. I am still ruined. My estates are gone, my fortune is lost. I have nothing to offer you. You have everything I want," I said. "You have honor and courage and a heart that sees me truly. You have stood beside me through revelations that would have driven others away. You have loved me not for my fortune, but despite it." I smiled through tears that had finally begun to fall. "I have 17 million pounds, Sebastian. Soon I may have 12 million more. What I lack is someone to share it with. What I lack is love." He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched the battle play across his features. Pride and longing, fear and hope, the weight of everything he had lost against the promise of everything we might build together. Then he smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise after an endless night. "Yes," he said, 1,000 times yes." He kissed me then, there in the drawing room of Whitmore Hall, before the assembled company and the scandalized Lady Pemberton and the magistrates who would soon rule in my favor. He kissed me as if the world had fallen away, as if we were the only 2 people in existence, as if the future stretched before us bright and limitless. When we finally parted, Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well," he said, "I believe we have sufficient evidence to proceed with the inheritance claim. Miss Ashford, or should I say the future Duchess of Ashworth, the Whitmore estate is yours." I looked around the room at the faces watching us. Some were smiling, moved by the romance of the moment. Others were calculating, already adjusting their opinions to accommodate the new reality. Lady Pemberton sat rigid and silent, her son's disgrace and my triumph twin blows from which she might never recover. I felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet peace. We left Whitmore Hall as the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. The carriage waited at the end of the drive, and Sebastian helped me inside with the tenderness of a man handling something infinitely precious. "Where shall we go?" he asked as the carriage began to move. "Back to Edinburgh? To London?" I thought about it, about all the places I had been and all the places I might go. London held my hotel, the Grand Belmont, transformed now from refuge to triumph. Edinburgh held solicitors and paperwork, the machinery of inheritance grinding slowly toward resolution. But neither of those places called to me. "Take me home," I said. "And where is home?" he asked softly. I looked at him, at this man who had entered my life as a stranger and would leave it as my husband. I thought about the journey that had brought us here, from a hotel lobby to a train compartment, from confessions of love to revelations of legacy, from two broken people to something stronger and more beautiful than either of us had been alone. "Home is wherever you are," I said. "It always has been." I simply did not know it until now. He pulled me close, and I rested my head against his shoulder as the carriage carried us through the gathering dusk. Behind us, Whitmore Hall receded into the distance, taking with it the ghosts of my grandmother's suffering, my father's rage, my own years of hiding and shame. Ahead of us lay a future I could not yet imagine, full of challenges and joys and the ordinary miracles of a life shared with someone who truly saw me. I was not the frightened girl who had fled society 3 years ago. I was not the invisible maid who had scrubbed floors and dreamed of nothing. I was Emmeline Ashford, heiress to 2 fortunes, owner of the Grand Belmont Hotel, soon to be Duchess of Ashworth. But more than any of those titles, I was a woman who had learned the hardest lesson of all, that our worth is not measured by the opinions of others, that dignity cannot be stripped away by scandal, that love finds us not when we are searching, but when we are brave enough to step out of the shadows and claim it. The snow began to fall again as we traveled, soft white flakes drifting past the windows like blessings. I closed my eyes and listened to the steady rhythm of Sebastian's heartbeat beneath my cheek, and I let myself believe in happy endings. Not the fairy tale kind, where troubles vanish and perfection reigns forever. The real kind. The kind where 2 imperfect people choose each other again and again through difficulty and doubt and the long work of building a life together. I had been broken. I had been rebuilt. And now, at last, I was whole. The carriage rolled on through the winter night, carrying us toward tomorrow. And for the first time in 3 years, I was not afraid of what tomorrow might bring. I was ready for it. We both were.